doing? I'm on the other side of a freaking wormhole.
What does it actually take to survive in an alien world? This episode had character growth for both Ortegas and Uhura, added lore about the Gorn and Starfleet survival training, as well as a brilliant display of leadership from Captain Pike. Let's go through these things and also talk about some other Star Trek episodes which dialogue strongly with Terrarium and which would pair well with it for a Star Trek binge-watching session. First, a bit of context. The episode begins with Erica getting prepared to go on a solo mission, and it's a big deal because it's the first time this is happening since the Doctor cleared her for solo missions after her mishap with the Gorn earlier in the season. The mission requires a pilot because they're exploring a region of space with some abnormal gravimetric readings. They can't pinpoint the origin of the gravitational problems, so that's why they need a shuttle. As it turns out, the problem was a wormhole, and the Enterprise loses contact with Erica almost as soon as they detect the anomaly. And at this point, we are very familiar with wormholes because we've seen Deep Space Nine, but this is happening 100 years before that. They know nothing about it. Even the question of whether or not a shuttle could survive going through a wormhole, if a person could survive traveling through a wormhole, that's a big unknown, and they have no way of knowing if Erica is alive. From that point on, the episode splits in two. The main plot involves Erica trying to stay alive in a faraway moon, contending with all the vicissitudes that are thrown in her way. The B-plot happens back in the ship, while they're trying to find a way to rescue their pilot. It's mostly about Captain Pike and Uhura this time. Pike is trying to balance his responsibilities to Starfleet. Because the Enterprise is supposed to rendezvous with the Constellation, they have to deliver some vaccines that are desperately needed elsewhere. With his responsibility towards his crew and his personal code of not leaving people behind. Uhura, who has gotten closer and closer with Erica the past few episodes, is struggling with imagining that her friend may not have survived and with coming up with a way of bringing Erica back and rescuing her. All the while, Una is taking the contrarian position and reminding them of the importance of the rendezvous with the Constellation. This episode started in a really nice place because we hardly ever get to see pilots getting solo missions like this. In fact, in a previous episode of Strange New Worlds, Erica was getting a little frustrated with how little she gets to go on away missions and how little she gets to see of other worlds because she's the pilot and she's always needed at the helm and she always has to stay back on the ship. Kind of like Trip was frustrated about never leaving Enterprise in the beginning. And it's true. And this time it even went further because this was a mission that was specifically tailored for a pilot. A mission that required high piloting skills. We don't get to see a lot of that in Star Trek. I mean, not quite like this, because when we see it, it's usually something that happens in very dire circumstances because an antagonist has showed up or something has gone horribly wrong. The survival of everyone in the ship depends on them getting through this incredibly difficult region of space, and you need a very good pilot to get them through, usually manually. This is how this kind of thing happens. But missions like these, missions that are part of the day-to-day life, the business of being a crew member on board a starship, we don't get to see them, certainly not the way we see them for scientists, because missions for scientists happen all the time. So this was very, very cool that we got to see something like this. I think in part this is because the pilots don't really get a lot of attention in other Star Trek shows if you stop to look at it. I mean, the one that got the most screen time was probably Tom Paris from Voyager, and he got to go on a lot of away missions, but usually not because piloting skills were needed. Travis would probably be the second one to get the most time, but he didn't get a lot of stories of his own, and when he did, it was much more about his background as someone who had grown up in space and about his piloting skills. Deep Space Nine didn't really need a pilot. In the Next Generation, when they needed one, it was either Picard or Riker at the helm, and the original series was very much a Kirk, Spock and McCoy show, so Sulu didn't get a lot of space to shine. What I'm saying is it's very nice to see pilots getting some attention now, and it's especially cool that this is happening on this ship because Captain Pike, unlike Picard or Janeway who have backgrounds as scientists, Captain Pike was a pilot, a test pilot of all things, so this is a especially good ship to be getting these kinds of stories. I also really appreciated that the focus was on Erica specifically. I think she's a great character, she's been growing and she's probably my favorite pilot in the fleet now. I've been waiting for an episode like this ever since we got the I Fly the Ship episodes. I think it was in the previous season. And she had some great moments in the season already, but this episode was all about her. And the best thing about that is that we get those small things, those small moments that make a character feel more alive. Like the way she looked at her brother's picture in her room and called him hermanito, or the way she always makes a paper airplane for good luck on missions. That was such a nice detail. And you know, there's more of a story there because she was kind of struggling with that in the beginning. She didn't want to take the paper. She kind of caved in at the last minute. There was some mental dialogue there that we didn't get to see, and I think we're going to discover more about that later on. Through Erica, we also learned more about Starfleet. She dropped a line about a Division 12, for instance, which is something we may hear more about in the future. But most of all, we learned about Starfleet survival training, and we hadn't seen it in quite this way. We learned, for instance, that shuttles have equipment that can be repurposed into a water condenser, and they saw her doing that and her making water, and it was such a good scene. Erica landed in an incredibly inhospitable moon. From the moment she opened her eyes, it was clear that the shuttle was gone, it was beyond repair, and her communication array was gone. So she was falling back on her Starfleet survival training, and I mean, can you imagine how cool it must be to take Survival in Alien Worlds 101 at the Academy? But because of her training, she knew she had to go outside and look for food, and when she was doing that, in an awesome outfit, by the way, she discovered there was someone else in that planet. And when she approached them to try and make contact, she discovered that that someone else was Gorn. Now, from the moment I saw the Gorn, I knew what kind of episode this was going to be. It immediately brought to mind The Enemy, which is The Next Generation Season 3, Episode 7, when Geordi is stuck in a planet that has these horrible storms that prevent him being beamed up to the Enterprise, and he's stuck there with a Romulan, and it starts with them being hostile towards each other, and eventually they cooperate to survive. So I knew this was going to be exactly the same kind of episode. And you know, I was watching this with some friends from the Star Trek Society, and one of them mentioned that the plot was a bit cliché, it was a bit obvious. And I hadn't thought it in those words, but I can't disagree with him that that's true. But I don't think that's a problem. You know, it made me think of Brandon Sanderson's writing lectures, because in those lectures he talks about how plot is the one element of the story when you can afford to not be surprising, and in fact it's probably better if you are not surprising, because it's very difficult to be original with plot and at the same time provide a satisfactory experience for the reader, or in this case the viewer. And I think Terrarium has just given us an excellent example of that, because yeah, the moment I saw the Gorn, especially the way she was introduced, saving Erica from that weird big centipede thing, I knew what the story was going to be about, but I was there for it every step of the way. It wasn't about whether or not they would cooperate, whether or not they would see a new side of each other, it was about how, and the how was especially interesting. A big part of this episode was the communication issue. And you know, I love the way Star Trek deals with communication, because they have the universal translator, which from a storytelling perspective is a fantastic device, because it just eliminates the issue of communicating with other aliens as a problem. And you can focus on the other elements of the story. You know that the universal translator is there, each person is speaking their own language, but the UT bridges the gap, and it works and it eliminates the problem. It's a great device, and it's made better because when the story focuses on communication, it's usually a great story. I'm thinking of course of Darmok, which again dialogues very strongly with this episode, because Darmok is also about two people stranded on a planet with difficulties in communication. But the way this particular episode deals with that issue is very ingenious, because Erica modifies her tricorder to fashion a very rudimentary translation device that is capable of recognizing yes and no from the Gorn's words, from the Gorn's vocabulary. And I think this was a great way to go about it, because, well, the result was great. It made communication easier, but didn't eliminate the communication problem. Most of all, I think it was believable, because as far as we know, Erica doesn't have a background in engineering or science or communication, and it would have been far-fetched for her to be able to fashion a universal translator on the spot. But I can believe that she knows enough to modify her tricorder to do something simple the way she did. Especially because the Gorn are a known species at this point, and the tricorder would have information about them, including information about their language. It made sense. While all of this was going on the planet, the situation on the Enterprise was tense. The star of the show here was the captain. You know, when Captain Pike first appeared on Discovery, in one of those early episodes, he said something like, "Starfleet is a promise. I give my life for you, you give your life for me." This leave no man behind mentality is present in all starship captains, all the ones that are leads in the show. It is more than that for Pike. It's not simply a matter of leadership. This is part of his personal code. It's part of who he is. And we know that because we know he's going to be called to make this sort of sacrifice. And that's what's going to bring him the horrible future that we know is coming. In this episode, he was struggling with that. And I think there was a little bit more in there as well, because Erica is a pilot, so I think there was an added sense of kinship there. Despite his own difficulties though, it was very clear why he is the captain. He is so incredibly mature. And this is a quality that it may sound obvious, but I think it's a very undervalued character. I mean, I admired him so much in this episode. I hope to be like that one day. Because, for instance, Una. I was a little impatient with Una when she kept reminding people that they had this other mission to attend to, that they had to deliver the vaccine. I wanted to scream at my computer, telling them, put Mbenga in a shuttle and send him to rendezvous with the Constellation. Tell the Constellation to increase their speed, call their ship, do something. But Captain Pike, he wasn't impatient with Una, not even once, because he understood what she was doing. She was doing something that was important. Even if what she was doing wasn't make things any easier for him. She is his partner, his number one. And that's so incredibly mature. And then there was how he behaved towards Uhura. That was incredible. Because Uhura was having a really tough time in this episode as well. From the start, Uhura was the one who was the most afraid. She was afraid that Erika had died, and she was afraid that they were going to abandon the search before they could be certain of that. And this was very clear from the go. From the first briefing when they were discussing this, she was like, we can't give up. And Pike looks up at her, and he's been very quiet in this briefing, but he looks up at her and he says, hey, no one's giving up. It felt personal and beautiful. It felt like he was placing a hand on her shoulder to let her know that the world had not ended, you know? I especially liked what happened towards the end, because Uhura is the one who comes up with a plan to rescue Erika. A very creative plan that I'm not gonna say what she does, but it's something very similar to what happens in Relics, which is the Next Generation episode that brings back Scotty and where we see the Enterprise in the original series. And Spock assists her in this plan, but when the captains go through it, he says, well, for this to work we need 60% scanning capability, and they don't have that. They have something like 56. And Uhura fudges the numbers a bit and tells him they have it. So they start the mission. And when it looks like everything has failed, she is going to come out to the captain and tell him the truth, because this is who she is. But before she can even say anything, Captain Pike says, I know you fudged the numbers, Uhura. Bending the rules, this is new for you, but it's not wrong for the right reasons. And what an amazing moment that was. You know, a couple of weeks ago, I posted a video about What is Starfleet, which is episode 7 of this season of Strange New Worlds. And in that commentary, in that brief analysis, one of the things I was talking about is how Starfleet is not a military organization, and that episode specifically landed a powerful argument in support of that. I think this kind of thing right here, this kind of encouragement to bend the rules, encouragement to think independently, to not blindly follow orders, this is one of the strongest things I think that speak in support of the thought that Starfleet is not a military organization, and I think that's a good thing. Pike was such a mentor through Uhura, through all of this. You know, he has a very different vibe from, like, Captain Picard felt more distant, he felt more like an old professor. And Sisko feels a bit like a stern father. But Pike feels kind of like an older brother. And he showed up for Uhura in this episode exactly when she needed it the most, and it was wonderful to watch. Other characters in the main crew were more marginally involved in the story. Spock was a big part of the mission. We didn't get to see a lot of him, but he was very much involved in the mission, and he was involved in helping Uhura come up with her plan. There was this great moment where all he did was he didn't leave, and it was beautiful. But essentially, Uhura was going through simulation after simulation and nothing was working out, and Spock said, look, this is illogical, just repeating the simulation is not going to change anything. But she had to keep going, but Spock doesn't go away, he stays. I read somewhere, I think, Leonard Nimoy talking about what he brought to Spock's performance and something that inspired him. And he was talking about how if you keep everything in, when you do something, even if it's something small, it feels huge. And this is what that felt like. Because Spock didn't say anything. There wasn't a big speech about friendship or loyalty or not giving up. He just didn't leave. And it was extremely powerful. Then there was Lon. Lon wasn't in this episode a lot, but she had a big part to play in the very end. And in fact, the end made me question why this story, a story about seeing the Gorn as more than an enemy, was written for Erika instead of for Lon. But I thought about it a little bit, and I think maybe Lon isn't ready for that yet, and I'm sure her moment is coming, her moment to reckon with this. Maybe in the next season. Seeing more of the Gorn was pretty cool. I really like what they did with the Gorn's appearance in Strange New Worlds. They modernized it a bit from the Gorn we've seen in the original series. But a lot of the times when we've seen them before, it was in episodes that had a strong horror influences, and we've seen them in the dark or moving very fast. This time you got to actually see the Gorn. And I think that was great. You know, in Arena, which is the first episode where the Gorn appeared, Captain Kirk talks about how he has to remind himself that this creature, this big lizard, is a sentient creature not unlike himself, that it's a captain of a ship as well. I understood that in this episode, and I'm so glad the episode provided that. And then I discovered more about them. There was the Gorn game, which they were playing, and the fact that Ortegas kept the piece in her quarters. Ah, such a sweet moment. In the end, this episode turned out to be a prequel to Arena, which by the way is a twist that I did not see coming, but I think it worked out great. I think Strange New Worlds does this kind of thing really well. I think they understand where they are in the timeline of Star Trek, and they use that very well. Anyway, this is it for now. Another great episode. This season is amazing. So far it's 9 out of 9. 9 episodes, 9 excellent episodes. There isn't a single bad episode this season. I am bracing myself because I think there will be a cliffhanger this Thursday. I'm hoping they don't make me suffer too much. Just please don't do anything like Wrath of Khan, please. But I'm very much looking forward to it. For now, this is it. I hope this analysis was interesting. Good night and live long and prosper.
I heard that you find